I wanted to start today by speaking of your biography a moment ago. Would you give us a brief professional autobiography?
Yes, sure. I went to university to the London School of Economics, expecting to study economics. When I got there, I took some economics, but it was remarkably tedious. I mean, it was taught pretty much like uh, a, a, a normal science after the fashion of Thomas Kuhn. And I
Mm,
happened to take, I mean, there were the British degree that I was in was one where I think I had to take five subjects in the first year, one political science, one economics, and then I had a choice of other things and a history course and other things. And I happened to pick a course in logic. And logic is normally taught in a way that makes the teaching of economics absolutely fascinating.
mm,
Um, but this was taught by a chap called Alan Musgrave, who followed what actually was Karl Popper's approach to teaching logic. And what he did was take you through a history of various problems in logic and in the philosophy of mathematics, introducing technical material pinned onto this historical account. And it was really fascinating. And I found it the most interesting of the courses that I was doing.
mm.
And as a result of that, in the end, specialized in philosophy. I then went and took an additional master's degree in it was Builder's Logic and Scientific Method, but it was philosophy and history of science and a variety of things. I then planned to do a PhD, but I thought that the best course of action would probably be to get another qualification on the basis of which I could actually make a living
Mm.
and then return to do that part time. And I started off studying librarianship, but was in contact with someone who'd been a former tutor of mine at the LSE to see if he'd give me a reference for something. And he said, well, would you be interested in working as Popper's assistant?
Mm.
And the answer was yes. I mean, it was a little bit as if a young Catholic had been asked, would you like to work for the Pope? And what I then did was worked as Popper's full-time assistant for the next 8 years. I then moved to the University of Edinburgh as a temporary lecturer, then moved in philosophy, then moved to the University of Manchester as a temporary lecturer in political theory. That came to an end. I then was able to pick up a job which turned out to be director of studies at the uh, Centre for Policy Studies in London, which brought me into the middle of British politics at the time. I wasn't terribly interested in what that might lead to because people typically went into being lobbyists or possibly into politics. And I was able to move instead to the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University.
Mm.
Um, and I was accepted there in the end as a research associate professor. And my task was typically to work with various different graduate students in different disciplines, and usually in the social sciences, who were in receipt of financial support, which was channeled through the Institute for Humane Studies. And I worked almost like a supplementary member of their dissertation committees.
Mm.
I then moved to the Australian National University, where I taught initially as a political theorist in the Department of Politics, and then ended up teaching in their Department of in their School of Philosophy. So that's basically how it went. And I ended up, after my retirement, still continuing to do some lecturing for them, including teaching a course on philosophy, politics, and economics. So those are the areas in which really I've worked.
What was it? What was it like working with Popper for those 8 years?
It was fascinating. I mean, Popper was someone who was absolutely dedicated to his work. If
Mm,
you went to see him and you got anything like an academic background, he'd immediately bring you into whatever he was doing, explain it to you, and so on. Working as his assistant was quite an interesting experience, not least because the situation at that time, and one's talking here about the early 1970s, was very, very different from now, because basically there were no personal computers, there was
mm.
no internet, and so everything typically had to be done as it were, by hand with typing with typewriters, things being retyped. But um, it was a it was interesting. I mean, Popper was personally dedicated to his work. He was when I was working with him. Um, I guess it's a little bit sobering to think about this, but a little bit younger than when I was working with him initially than I am now. But he would get so tied up in things that if he got new ideas, he got get very excited and would often work right through the night working
Mm,
these things out. Um, he also was incredibly dedicated in the sense that I think that other than when people came out to visit him, he would just be at work on various issues and projects. He was in touch by telephone with various friends. He would get papers and letters from friends of his from all over the world. And he would follow up then different kinds of intellectual leads. So I could never tell what he might be working on next. And so when I worked with him when he was putting together the papers that formed his book, Objective Knowledge. I
mm,
worked with him when he was, the work here was being done largely by him and a friend of his who'd been a former assistant called David Miller on
mm,
his
mhm,
answers to his critics in Schulp's The Philosophy of Karl Popper. I worked with Popper on the revision of his autobiography, which was published separately from The Philosophy of Karl Popper in Unended Quest. And then we worked on various other projects, including the last thing that I was concerned with was his collaborative book with Professor Sir John Eccles called The Self and Its Brain, which was on the mind-body problem. But
mhm,
during this period, I mean, there was hardly an area of philosophy that his work didn't touch on, and for which I was then concerned with reading around, fetching materials for him, reading over manuscripts and suggesting comments. I mean, initially, it was really pretty low-level stuff. I mean, Popper was originally a speaker of German. He developed quite a good English style, but when he was caught up with ideas, he would often sort of lose track of English structure. And so one of my tasks was to go over the work. He also um, loved fiddling around and making small revisions to things
mm,
so that he would be endlessly adding or taking away commas, or
mm,
he would have recourse, for example, to a book by a chap called Fowler called Modern English Usage. And this was you could almost see it as Popper's Bible. And so
mm,
he would often get up from his desk and go to that and consult that, and there'd be long discussions about small points in his work. But it was very much a full-time job. I mean, I was notionally registered for what became my PhD. But I didn't get much time to work on that just because of the kind of all-encompassing nature of the work for Popper.
Right. Well, yeah, nowadays we have search engines. We can just go to the internet, and if I'm writing something, I use Chat GPT even
Yes,
to look up something. However, I have noticed as of late, not to get on this topic, but that is sometimes wrong, and I will have to
yes,
double, triple
yes.
check that
Oh,
because
yes, yes.
I'll ask for like a
But you
quote
see,
and it'll give the wrong quote. So,
oh, that's right. But you see, when I was working with Popper, it wasn't the case, for example, that libraries had computer-based catalogs.
mm,
So to try and find something that he needed to work on was really quite a task. I mean, there were various published catalogs. I mean, there was a published Library of Congress catalog, a similar one for the big British Library. There were various published sources giving references to journal articles, but it was just much more difficult to find them.
mm.
And then typically, I would either have to go and find physically where they are in London and copy them, or request the things via interlibrary loans. So you're just talking about a very different kind of life from anything that's
Right.
comparable now.
Okay, well that is great. Let's move into what we were going to talk about today is I wanted to start off with Popper's epistemology, which is my passion currently, and getting into that, and then sort of weave into Popper's politics and his open society and all that kind of stuff. So, in order to study the growth of knowledge, Popper eventually formed frameworks, which he called metaphysical research programs. What are they, and how do they
Okay,
work?
I have a little story to tell here.
Okay.
Popper, when he wrote his book Logik der Forschung, which was translated as The Logic of Scientific Discovery, was writing in a setting where there were people who had similar kind of interest to him, but who were members of the so-called Vienna Circle. And their view was typically one in which one should concentrate on science and logic, and where metaphysics was to be got rid of, and often it was claimed that it was meaningless. Popper took the view that they were wrong about this, and he was conscious himself of holding metaphysical views. For example, the realist idea that the world is real, it exists independently of us as to other people, and so on and so on and so on. But he was also conscious of the fact that there was a diversity of such views, and also that at the time he hadn't got an account of how you could argue for the preferability of one to another of these. Accordingly, in The Logic of Scientific Discovery, what you get is, first of all, Popper emphasizing the idea that metaphysical statements could be meaningful, and indeed that some of them had played an important role in the guiding of the development of science.
Mm,
But he concentrated in Logik der Forschung on the idea that what we need to do is to produce theories which are open to testing, theories which are falsifiable. We should try and get these put to the test, and if they don't work out, to try and replace them with something better, where those theories which we would then aim for, which are better, would set out to try to explain what we've been able to explain in the past, to deal with what we'd found to be problematic, but they might even, and this was something he got onto a little bit later, they might even lead us to correct what we had up to that point taken to be simple reports as to what was factually the case. Over, it was, though, the case in his Logic of Scientific Discovery that he said really, well, how you react if there is a falsification is going to depend a bit on what your view is of the aim of science. And for Popper, who'd been very impressed with Einstein's work, he took the view that you were aiming at truth and that what you should do if there was a falsification was to make a change to your theories or to the other assumptions that you were working with, which would serve to correct the problem, but also would make further claims about the world. But he contrasted this with a view which he said it's perfectly possible for someone to hold, which is to take the aim of science simply as being to conserve as well as possible our knowledge. And he had a discussion of ideas that he called conventionalism. He said, in effect, you could be a conventionalist. He would, by contrast, be wanted to be a realist. And he said, well, look, if you're a realist, then you would adopt my methodological ideas. If, though, you were a conventionalist, you might adopt ideas, for example, close to those which were later championed by Quine, the philosopher of science, where the notion was that if there is some problem, you make the minimal mutilation possible to deal with it. And so there was a contrast. Popper clearly set out his own preference for his approach, but he wasn't at that time, he didn't have at that time a theory to hand as to how you can critically appraise it. Now, what then happens is that in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, Popper starts, as you mentioned, to talk about so-called metaphysical research programs. And the idea here is the following: that there may be competing programmatic ideas as to how we might understand the world. At one level, they are metaphysical ideas, for example, as you may have the metaphysical theory of atomism, which says, in effect, that if there is something sort of concrete which looks as if it's continuous, what you need to do is to find the small things of which it's composed. You may have other views which stress instead continuity and things of this kind. And what Popper was able to do, first of all, was to talk about the influence of these different kinds of programmatic ideas through the history of science. He then, though, in a couple of pieces published in the 1950s, talked about the way in which one could, in principle, criticize metaphysical ideas of a kind which were directed towards solving problems just by comparing their ability to resolve the problems they had set out to solve and whether there were any further difficulties about them. He also, in a second piece, talked about the way in which Leibniz had offered a criticism of the ideas, programmatic ideas in physics, which had influenced, which had been influenced by Descartes, in which everything was seen as mechanical, where Leibniz argued, but if you consider two mechanical objects that just hit into one another and then bounce off, it's difficult to make anything of this if the if reality consists, just as it were, of hard bodies which have no elasticity to them. And Leibniz developed this as a criticism, a philosophical criticism of Cartesian programmatic ideas. And so what you get coming out of this is the notion that in Popper, while these things are always at the status of conjectures, different metaphysical research programs may serve to influence the development of science, and also the metaphysical ideas in themselves may also be open to criticism. It's
Mm.
also possible, and this is something that Imre Lakatos did, while in some other ways moving away from Popper, stressing that one can make evaluations of how well different such programmatic ideas are doing so far in actually inspiring science which is making progress, which is being successful. And I think that one can bring that element of things in as well. So what you get from this is the basic stuff in Popper, stressing that our ideas are always tentative, that they are always open to falsification, that in effect we should learn by way of dialogue with other people who favor other views, because they may be able to tell us what's wrong with ours, and also should make our ideas as testable as possible, but that also it's useful to articulate and open to criticism metaphysical research programs. And Popper, in his book, which was written as the postscript to The Logic of Scientific Discovery, but which was then published in 3 separate volumes, quite much, about 30 odd years after it was written.
Mm.
In this, Popper not only discussed these ideas about metaphysical research programs, but he himself offered a metaphysical research program for science related to his own ideas about indeterministic propensities. So
Mm.
that's just a quick overview. You may want to come back and question me on it, or to ask for supplementation of particular points. You might alternatively just say, can we move on and talk about something else?
Well, no, so I read, since you and I were exchanging emails, I read Unending Quest, and in there he does mention Darwinism as a metaphysical research
That's
program.
right.
And could you elaborate on it? That seems to be Darwinism is something that was basically Karl Popper's epistemological framework, is that he trial and error, like there's within Darwinism you have mutations, and then you have natural selection that weeds out the bad mutations and retains the good mutations. And analogous to that, within metaphysics, you have ideas that are sort of like mutations. They're creative ideas, just pop out of, well, no, we don't know how creative. I don't know how creative ideas come about. There's no logic to it. They come out, and then we say them out loud, and then people around us can criticize those ideas, and they either go by the wayside or they're retained, as in Darwinism. Am I getting that right as far as how Popper looked
Well,
at it?
that is certainly the case, although it's a slightly complicated story, as quite often these things are.
Mm.
There are different stages to his approach to these things. First of all, before Popper was interested in working in philosophy, he was interested in psychology. And he
Mm.
did a lot of work in psychology in which his ideas were close to the biological approach to psychology that Seltz, a member of the so-called Würzburg school,
Mm.
had worked on. And there are traces of this. I mean, Popper moved away from studying psychology, but there are traces of it in the sense that, for example, in one of the essays in his Conjectures and Refutations, he talks about the anticipations of reality that there may be on the part of young animals and so on.
Mm.
And Popper's view at that level was influenced by biological ideas, in the sense that while you could talk about Popper as being an empiricist in the sense that he wants us to learn uh, uh, what we misunderstand about the world by way of knowledge that comes through our senses and basic statements that we can agree to with other people and so on. There is a strong thrust to his work which says, look, in many respects, you can see our sensory organs as functioning like hypotheses about the world, that there's interpretation built into our very biology. And this theme was always around in Popper's work. And in addition, he drew certain analogies between his approach to science and ideas about natural selection.
Mm.
There was, though, quite a period through which he was concerned with other kinds of issues, although he did get into a bit of a discussion about what the status was of evolutionary theory. And I mean, he said somewhat different things at different times about this. Some statements of his have been kind of picked up often by opponents of evolutionary theory who say, well, Popper was saying that it wasn't really science, it was metaphysics. This is a rather complicated business, not least because for Popper, for something to be a metaphysical research program isn't necessarily a way of putting it down. But I think his view would be one needs to distinguish between programmatic ideas about how we should see the world and seek for explanations and stuff that is more directly testable. His own later work, particularly, say, in objective knowledge, was rather more self-consciously taking up evolutionary and biological themes. And there is for Popper a certain kind of almost logic of the situation of all living things, that they have to work by way of hypotheses and refutations, and that in this context, human beings have got an advantage over certain other kind of animals, which is that we are much more flexible. We can also entertain ideas which aren't things that are just simply biologically based into us. Whereas I find, I mean, I have a cat of which I am very fond. My wife sometimes says, "You pay more attention to him than you do to me." But I've noticed that he tends to get into and then stick to various routines, even if they don't work out particularly well.
Yes.
Whereas human beings can be much more flexible.
Right. I'll admit here, I got into Popper's work, and I'm going to tie this into what I'm about to say. I got into Popper's work through the work of David Deutsch. Are you familiar with David Deutsch?
I know of him. I don't, I need really to sit down to read his work systematically. I mean, not knowing anything much about his work, I have certain kinds of small concerns, in particular that, as I mentioned before, in Popper, ideas about indeterminism physical indeterminism come to play a very significant role. And for Popper, this is something that he thought that one should explore, not just at, and indeed at, a quantum level, but running through physical reality as a whole. My understanding is that Deutsch doesn't think much of Popper's ventures into the interpretation of quantum theory. And a query that I would have, in a sense, is that if one gives up on indeterminism, is it just at a quantum level, or is it across the board? And if it's across the board, then there may be a whole bunch of problems in terms of how then you reconcile your views with other aspects of Popper's work.
That it's weird. Yeah, or Deutsch actually does disagree with Popper completely on Popper's writings on quantum theory. He actually said that
Right.
he actually met with him. I've heard him in an interview, and he said he and Bryce DeWitt met with Popper, and they tried to explain themselves. And he said Popper received their ideas, in the moment, like, oh. And he said that Popper was like, well, gosh, I have a book in print that I need to go and maybe have it taken,
Right.
fix what I've put in there. And then it came out, and nothing ever
Right.
changed. And Deutsch
Right.
thinks that he was probably. In the moment, just being tactful or polite.
I I don't know. I mean, one also has to bear in mind how old Popper was at that point,
Mm,
and also that for Popper, kind of revising anything on the one side tended to go out continuously, but on the other tended to mean that if he got into revising things, they never got published. I mean,
mm,
I referred previously to his book, The Postscript, and
right.
this was intended to come out material as literally as a postscript to the English translation of the Logic of Scientific Discovery, which um, was due to come out in 1954. The
Mm,
postscript eventually came out as three separate books edited by Bill Bartley in the early 1980s. So what I would say is that
right.
it is one thing to um, uh, uh, think that he might wish to revise something. There is a real danger that once he's started, and particularly, as I've suggested, because his ideas about indeterminacy, in a certain sense, run right through a lot of his work, including on the mind body problem and so on, that
Mm,
it would really take an absolutely massive reworking. But
right.
I
Yeah.
can't sensibly say any more than this, than just sort of wave a flag at this point and say, I have come across this as an issue. It is something which, given the opportunity, I should really get into and look at properly. And it's not very sensible for me to try and speculate about stuff that I haven't read.
The reason I bring him up, though, going back to when we were talking about the metaphysical programs, is that Deutsch adds an addendum to Popper's work, which I think is extremely useful. Which he talks about the ideas of good explanations, like we are science is in pursuit of good explanations, and his definition of a good explanation are explanations that are hard to vary. And he would describe Darwinism or Darwinian theory, in particular neo-Darwinism, as a good explanation because it's very hard to vary. You can't change aspects of it without it falling apart. Whereas, just to contrast this, a bad explanation would be that God did it. That's a bad explanation because that can be applied to anything in the world at any time in the world, and you can change every aspect of it, and it always
Yes,
works. And I feel like this is good because Darwinism in particular can be somewhat of a problem where nowadays you have people using Bayesianism as an epistemological framework where they're basically the idea is that knowledge is growing up around us, and the more evidence we have, the better supported this knowledge is, and the more closer to truth it is, which in actuality, that's not what we're doing here. We're not trying to build up with like a solid framework for knowledge. We're actually just in pursuit of good explanations, and that are always going to be fallible. And do you see? Have you
well,
noticed this trend within science where people are using Bayesianism as a
Bayesianism is very widely used, and I've come across people just taking it for granted as the obvious approach. I
mm,
guess what I would say is that it is there on my sort of list of things to be read up on and worked through, along with David Deutsch.
Right.
If I sound really pretty feeble about this, it's really because a lot of my own work has been on issues of social and political philosophy,
Right.
and there is a certain limit to what one can engage with at any time. And I'm also obviously conscious of the fact that I'm no spring chicken, and
Mm.
so I have no idea how long I will have to venture into areas that I put into that kind of category, or indeed how long I'll have the capability of dealing with certain of these things. I mean, there's always
Right.
the risk with, especially with stuff on philosophy of quantum mechanics, where you can say, well, at a certain level, anyone intelligent can understand some things. At another level, you probably have actually to be able to get into the mathematics, and not everybody can do that. I mean, I found my own private experience is it's a bit like with languages. I mean, my brother really had got quite a facility with languages and worked as a translator of French and Russian into English for UNESCO.
Mm.
I have attempted to learn various languages, and I am simply hopeless.
Mm.
On another kind of category, I mean, I did mathematics up to kind of bottom university level, but I never really got on with it. It just always seemed to me like learning a bunch of tools or techniques, and
I
I
think
could
it's
never
right.
really
Yeah.
understand how anything fitted together. And I took a course in the foundations of mathematics, and this seemed to give me yet another bunch of disconnected techniques. And
Yeah.
then one might say, well, what about looking at the foundations of mathematics? But the difficulty there was that there was another bunch of interesting but really complex problems, but how they connected up with anything else. And I just found in the end this is really being something which I respected, but it just kind of wasn't for me. And so I think that there are certain limitations that I always had, and I suspect that as I get older, to attempt to go back to any of these would be that much more difficult.
The well, in response to this, people of a philosophical bent who are into philosophy would definitely be appreciated to hear you speak like this, because it's very Socratic in the sense that you know your limitations and you know what you don't know, which is
Yeah,
that's
but
admirable.
the danger is often that if people say they know their limitations, that typically means that they think they're okay with a whole lot of other
Right.
things.
Right.
But this is, in a certain sense, I think, a key point from Popper, where he stresses not just the fallibility of our knowledge, but also that it's just how vital it is to have critical input from people who have other views and perspectives.
Mm, hmm.
And I mean, one of my worries these days about universities is that typically they seem just to have people in them who are picked because they are in fundamental agreement about things.
Right.
It's as if there isn't anything to learn from other people. And I
Mm,
think life can often become rather. I mean, I'm not saying that dealing with people coming from other kinds of traditions is at all easy. But
mm.
if you take seriously our own fallibility and our concern to try to reach truth, then people and traditions that are different from ours are invaluable. And
Right.
again, Popper, in his paper, The Myth of the Framework, which is now in the
Mm.
book, The Myth of the Framework, stressed the importance of attempting to have dialogue and conversations with
Clash of
people.
cultures. Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yeah.
but where you shouldn't, for Popper, expect that this is going to bring you to agreement, unanimity. You may nonetheless be able to learn something, and it may give you something to think about. But I think an important difference between Popper's approach and that, for example, of people who've been influenced by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, is that they typically put a big premium on dialogue with the expectation of consensus. Whereas I think for Popper, there are certain things in respect of which one might hope to get agreement, very basic things, like, is this a glass of water in front of me or something of this kind? And similarly, in areas of ethics that you might get agreement, that it really becomes important to try to avoid suffering, starvation, and things of this kind. Whereas people may, in other respects, have different ethical or metaphysical systems about which there can be discussion, where you may be able to say to people, I think there's a problem about that idea of yours, but where you can't expect that those discussions will just result in agreement. And it
Right.
just seems to me to be very worrying, the degree to which it now tends to be accepted in the setting of universities, that about a whole number of often quite substantive things, all decent people, all rational people should all agree about these. But it may be tricky because there may be people who are, to use an Australian expression, rat bags. I mean, basically, who not only hold views, but are awkward and really a pain in the neck to deal with them. But nonetheless, if you persist, you may be able to learn something.
Right. Do you think that what's going on in universities nowadays? I recently wrote an article about Baconian epistemology, and I feel like that's kind of what's going on within universities. It's like this idea that there is a book of nature, all the knowledge that is out there is within the frame, and basically it's all sort of solidified right now, and we're just kind of universities are sort of stagnated right now in how they're operating. There's no nobody wants to hear bold ideas currently.
Well, it depends, I think, what kind of area you're in,
Mm,
because you may get that in some areas. You may also get people, for example, who've got an interest in different substantive scientific disciplines, who are interested basically just trying to map where people are, rather than being willing to cause trouble by saying, well, look, if you are operating with this kind of notion about a gene and you're operating with something that's inconsistent with it, doesn't this mean that there's a fruitful and interesting problem? But
right.
by contrast with all of that, you've got a lot of work. Well, you've got a lot of work now in economics, which tends to be moving away from working with models and theories into stuff which is increasingly technical, but where it seems to me it doesn't often have any kind of focus on or applicability to the real life problems that we're dealing with. And you've got other areas in the humanities and social sciences where you have in part a lot of commonality with Popper, because Popper stressed the degree to which we interpret the world on the basis of our theories and ideas.
Hmm.
In the social sciences, though, you tend now to get a lot of people who take that idea seriously, but who take that somehow to be the end of the story, and who
Mm,
really depict different people as living in different worlds, um, and where there's no possibility, and this differs strongly from Popper, of us being able to get together to work out how we can criticize and improve on these things, but where these people, too, it seems to me, don't really face the issue that if people are living in different worlds, if they're experiencing things in different ways, and it relates to matters to do with human well-being, then isn't it important to try to see how we should resolve matters? And what I find is slightly strange is that there a lot of people who've been influenced by aspects of post-structuralism and postmodernism,
Right.
who have a kind of relativity about views of the world pertaining almost to factual matters and empirical matters in the social sciences, but who seem to think that you could only take up legitimately one position on what is good or bad in politics or ethics. But clearly, there is room for an enormous amount of diversity there as well. And for the very, very reasons that I talked about earlier, when I was talking about the significance of there being other traditions and people that we can learn from, that simply forcing people who have views different from yours to be quiet is cutting off the possibility that you might have of learning from them. And I mean, I'm talking with you today about Popper, but one of the things that has struck me very much from my work on Friedrich Hayek is an argument that he made effectively to say, look, a big issue in the social sciences which relates to politics and public policy is that we may at any one point have inherited certain institutions and traditions and habits. There may be good reasons for keeping some of these in place. They may enable us to do things, but at the same time, particular ones of these we may discover in the theoretical social sciences are incompatible without also being able to do other things. I mean, there's a sense in which our, well, you get in part issues about so-called path dependency. I mean, you've had in the past quite a lot of people looking at Scandinavian welfare states and saying, well, wouldn't that be something nice for us to have? And you might say, well, yes, but it might be the case that given what the history of America has been or what the history of England has been, and given how we've been formed by it, it might be extremely difficult in some ways to change ourselves such that we could take on and make work these other sorts of institutions. I mean, there may be possibilities, but you can't, I mean, the idea of just being able to do this at will might be a little bit on a par with my saying, well, I've always wanted to be good at high jump. And someone might say to you, well, Jeremy, I mean, if you tried this when you were 11, you might have got somewhere. But between then and now, you've done a whole lot of sitting at desks and reading books. You've also put on a great deal of weight. And this is now not something, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I could go on a diet, exercise, stop writing, stop reading, and I might then be able to jump a little higher than I can at the moment, but not necessarily something satisfactory. So there are issues of that kind, but you may also have issues, as, for example, Hayek himself argued, where his view was that if you have a large-scale market economy and need cooperation between people, you need to be guided by a system of prices. And this provides incentives, it provides indications to people of where, in a sense, there is more demand for them to do that than that. I mean, I've often thought about this in terms of, well, I have on and off been able to find people who'll pay me to give lectures in political theory or philosophy. I've yet, other than as a joke, found someone who would offer me employment as a go-go dancer. Now, I mean, the issue here that Hayek wanted to argue is that once you have certain of these systems in place, then there are some other things that you can't have at the same time if they're going to work. You might say, well, can't we modify those systems? Yes. But if you do that, you may then find that there are certain other kinds of outcomes that you don't have. And it seems to me that it's this notion of different systems that we have as constraining us, of different things as having important unintended consequences that has in a way been lost sight of. I mean, you get some people on the hard left who are conscious of this, but they think it's something which in principle has got an easy resolution to it. It seems to me that whether or not one agrees with the specifics of Hayek's argument, there is something that is really posing a serious problem for us, but which often these days just seems to be ignored.
Mm. This well, this leads us into Popper's open society, which I wanted to talk about. The what just for anybody listening, because some people are confused by this. The people could be new to Popper completely. What does Popper mean, in short, by an open society?
Okay, I think the simplest way of thinking of an open society is of its being a society in which inherited social and political arrangements are in principle open to questioning and challenge
Mm,
by anybody. At the same time, clearly, if you've got an existing set of arrangements, there may be some challenge, there may be some outstanding problems.
mm,
But you can't be sure that your challenge is right, and you can't be sure that what seems to you to be a good idea is actually going to be correct. And
mm,
what you're going to need are, it seems to me, a couple of things. I mean, on the one side, of taking seriously, as one does in Popper's writings about science, what the existing theories, what the existing practices are actually accomplishing, and then considering, okay, if there's a problem about them, how can you move to something which will still enable you to do what you want, but also resolve that problem? But
mm,
the other thing is to make sure that you find ways in which ordinary people, as they come across problems and difficulties about things, have the opportunity to voice what the problems are. And in my retirement, I did a bit of volunteering for a local charity, which, amongst other things, assisted some people, for example, if they were out of work, uh, they needed to be able to show that they had been seeking employment in order to get unemployment benefits. And
mm,
they would come for assistance to this center that I was working in. But a problem, in a sense, was that aspects of this system were just nuts. I mean, that you've
mm,
got, for example, a chap who was a retired forester who was in his 60s, who had had some major problem with his legs, and so could only get round with a pretty robust cane.
mm,
And he was being told, well, you need to look for work. But I mean, he would have been the kind of chap who, at his age, if his legs were all right, could have assisted a tree surgeon after trees had been cut down in cleaning up the branches with a chainsaw. Um,
mm,
Given his actual situation, it would have been madness for him to try anything like this. But on the other hand, I mean, he was a very much, I mean, he was a big, rough outdoors man, and it
right.
just wasn't obvious what he could do for a living um, outside of that field in which he'd been working in, which no longer worked. But you had a system where someone in this situation was then having to spend a lot of time or waste a lot of time going around every 2 weeks, notionally seeing if there were jobs that he could apply for, when the problem, in a sense, was that it was the system which they'd got wrong.
Right.
But what I've tended to find in Britain is that there just aren't good ways in which ordinary people have the opportunity to say, look, I find myself caught up in this and the system doesn't work. I mean, people just put up with it.
Mm,
But,
mhm,
but on the other hand, it's not necessarily the case that there is an obvious way to solve the problem. And so,
Right.
in a sense, it seems to me that if you took Popper seriously, you would recognize with him what he calls the rational unity of mankind, that anyone, by virtue of their particular situation, may be able to spot that something has gone wrong, but where it seems to me you then need to add to this ways of enabling people to actually voice what the problems are, but then recognize that moving to a better system may be actually something that's very difficult, and where you may find, with regard to a welfare system, that there just isn't any way in which you can cope with all the problems you'd like to
Mm.
cope with. But
Uh,
I would take it that this is a kind of key aspect of Popper's approach in an open society.
Popper, yes, yeah, that's a good definition. Popper, I was thinking about this the other day. He talks about historicism a lot, which I think he coined this term, or if not, it's a very obscure term regardless. But as far as I can tell, it's almost like applying the inductive method to society. You look at what happened in the past, and then with that knowledge, you try to predict the past of a society, that is, with its government or whatever, king or whatever they got, institutions, and then you try to predict what's going to happen in the future from that evidence of the past. And what Popper does is, with the open society, or his method, it seems to me, is exactly what he did with his epistemological approach, which is you take the existing structure of whatever is there. Let's say it's like the United States in 17, let's just pick a date, 1760, and the slavery is still in effect. And then you have people that are, thinking like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right. Like there's people that are, we're saying they're 3/5 of a person. This doesn't make sense. Let's adjust. Let's see if we can adjust this. And then they correct that error, which, uh, basically the society is dynamic, where you can have people give input and correct, as you said a moment ago, errors in the system. And then, but again, it's going to be, as Popper says, it's going to be tentative, because then you're going to have many other errors that pop up because of this correction, and so on and so forth. Is this sort of how you would
Okay,
look at it?
well, there are various different issues there. Can I just try and unpick them a bit? First
Yeah, yeah.
of all, there's this notion of historicism.
Mm,
There was a problem about this in the following sense, that there was in German a term historismus,
mm,
and Popper, when he was talking about historicism, distinguished between historicism and what he called historism.
mm,
And when he was talking about historism, he was meaning what people had been talking about using that German term. Now, all of this then gets a little bit complicated, but roughly speaking, historicism for Popper is the idea that history has a particular trajectory of
mm,
its own, that it's going somewhere. And you could take this back, for example, to notions of divine providence, of God as working out his purposes through the instrumentality of human agents. And I remember at one point when I was a little bit younger, going to Sunday school and being told about the way in which the Romans had constructed this amazing system of Roman roads for
mm,
the military purposes, but where I was told, but God was working his purposes out through this, because these could then serve as paths for the transmission of Christianity. And
mm,
you get notions of, as it were, uh, people having their own ideas and ideals, but bringing about something different, but where there was a rationality to this course of events. And one important thinker in terms of this was the German philosopher Hegel, who basically thought that there was a pattern which he sometimes referred to as the cunning of reason, where, as a result of the unintended consequences of the actions, particularly of key people who are inspired by particular ideas, you have what one can see retrospectively as the development of ideas, for example, of political freedom. And this, in certain respects, then gets taken over in some interpretations of Marxism. So that you
Mm.
can see some readings of Marxism as saying, in effect, well, there has been this plot running through history such that, as an unintended consequence of the flowering of the human spirit, you have different kinds of social arrangements leading up to the potential, once all of this is understood, for the working class to self-consciously realize the final step of, as it were, human prehistory, and to bring into being some. Now, Popper's view was at that level that these ideas were defective. They were
Mm.
often sometimes argued by way of analogy with how you could see developments in astronomy, but Popper argued, well, this wasn't typical of science because you have in this situation systems which are largely going along under their own steam rather than depending on other things. And so he
Mm.
was critical of some of the intellectual foundations of this, but he also wanted to argue that ideas of that kind had had a pernicious effect in Austria and Germany, in the sense that people who were communists and people who were socialists who were influenced by Marxist ideas really hadn't got together to try to resist the rise of
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Hitler and like-minded people. They rather thought that there was a trajectory leading on to socialism,
Right.
and that really they just had to be limited by what would help in the development of that. But Popper also was critical of what he thought were similar ideas in other areas too. For example, he said that at his own time, some people had moral ideas which really saw the realization of the realization, indeed, the inevitable realization of a particular set of political and social arrangements as being something that was validated by the fact that it would come about and that it was futile to resist that. But Popper was also interested in music.
Mm.
He his Unended Quest, he talks about his early and serious interest in music. But he thought that at the time at which he was living, there were ideas about progress in music, about people who were supposedly ahead of their time, who were writing the music of the future and so on. And he basically said, these ideas also are terrible. You should concentrate just on what is worthwhile. So he is dismissive of a whole lot of things which he thought were particularly influential. Around the time at which he was writing on both the left and the right.
Mm.
Because I don't know if have you ever seen the movie Cabaret?
No, I have not. I
Ah,
know of it
well,
though. Yeah.
it is well worth seeing because you have this situation of uh, kind of somewhat uh, debauched life
Mm.
in Germany,
Mm.
with the background of the rise of the Nazi movement.
Mm.
And they have at one point a kind of young Aryan looking kid in an outside setting with a kind of umpire band in the background, singing something about the future belongs to us. And
Mm.
gradually, other people, then ordinary people, join in and are singing this as well. And so Popper
Oh, that's
found
interesting.
that he
Yeah.
was in a setting where people both on the left and on the right were talking, as it were, about the what they were doing as being validated
Right.
by a kind of intrinsic
Revelation or something.
tendencies to
Yeah.
history. And so he was reacting strongly against that and arguing in much more plain and simple terms that there is a sense in which what happens in history is up to us, that we have got choices in front of us, that we can, as it were, attempt to make the world a better place, but that it isn't inevitable. But what we shouldn't do is think that in some sense history is behind us, or we just have to, what we have to do is just to fit in with some preordained path.
Yeah, so that reminds me of right now here's a so that was what I was missing, the piece of the puzzle I was missing to my analogy to induction with my with historicism was the idea that Popper talks about it as like people thought of themselves on a timeline, whereas you have A has to happen, then B has to happen, then C has to happen, then utopia or whatever the case may be. And
Yes,
yeah, and then he and a
but
lot of
but
people.
where
Oh, go
but
ahead.
where
I'm sorry.
too a key element of this is that you can see some of these later ideas as being something like secularizations of
Right.
ideas about divine providence.
Hmm.
And this doesn't mean that all religious people necessarily think in these terms, or indeed that, for example, all Marxists would necessarily agree that there is this sort of pattern of historical inevitability leading up to socialism.
Right.
But it was certainly something which was an influential view at the time at which Popper was writing, and he thought that it was intellectually flawed, but that its practical consequences were pernicious.
Yeah, well, I get fearful whenever I see like what's going on in the Middle East right now, and you have people that do believe in things like revelation and stuff, and Popper brings in this notion of the Oedipus effect, which is the idea that your if a group of people all believe something, it might inadvertently manifest that something happening. Could you elaborate on that maybe, Jeremy, for a moment?
Yes, yes, certainly. I mean, the notion was that in the original case of Oedipus,
Mm,
there was this forecast that something dire would happen, and that I can't remember the details. I mean, whether he would kill his own father or something of this sort. But
right,
measures were then taken to try to avoid this happening, but the measures themselves actually indirectly had the consequence that it was brought about. And
right.
when Popper was then talking about the so-called Oedipus effect, it was really this problem about uh, uh, interference with what we're studying by the forecasts that we're making.
Mm. Oh man, I don't want to keep you too much longer, Jeremy, but
Well,
this
it's
is
fine. I mean, what I would say is that if you want to if you would like, and if I don't know whether people readily listen to the podcast, but if they
mm,
do, if you and they would like a rematch, we can actually go back, because I know that when we were talking in principle about some of these things, we plan to cover a lot more ground than
right.
actually we've managed. I mean, I'm sorry, but if you interview aging men, you're liable to get anecdotes. But
Right.
on the other side of it, there is it's often, I find, useful to give concrete illustrations of things rather than zapping people with abstract ideas that they're not familiar with, where they're just supposed to react to the abstract ideas as such. So I'd be perfectly happy if you'd like to bring this one to a conclusion, but that I'd be perfectly willing, if you want us to talk on another occasion, to do so.
That would be great. Before, actually, that would be very good, Jeremy, because there's so much we can cover here. But before I let you go, one more question, and this is relevant to now. In our correspondence, you do talk about like you sort of mentioned like with social media and stuff. What's a particular? Let me just put it this way: what is a particular problem that you see as far as information flow is happening currently in regards to social media? Do you see, is there something that you're concerned about there?
Yes. Although I mean, it's a difficult issue just on the grounds that social media and what is involved in them are changing so quickly that
Mm,
unless one is really up with current developments, what one says might just be rather old-fashioned. But there
mm,
is an interesting book by an American academic lawyer called Cass Sunstein,
mm,
called #Republic, and in which he argued, but illustrating this in terms of America, the history of American constitutional ideas. He
mm,
stressed the way in which, very much along the lines similar to those which I've referred to in connection with Popper, that a key role in a certain sense was supposed to be played by respectful discussions amongst people who had different perspectives.
mm,
And what he drew attention to, and I'm not sure if to what extent this is overcome now, is that you've got a situation in which social media are typically operating in ways that inadvertently allow people to create a kind of communities of yes people. I mean, in
mm,
the
mhm.
sense that they are typically interested in my preferences, on keeping me on a page where I can see their adverts, where they
Right.
can flog to uh, people um, who they want to sell adverts to, that there
Mm,
is a particular demographic, but also someone who likes cats,
mm,
and so on and so on and so on, but where it may be much more specific. But that in order to keep my attention, first of all, things work on the basis very often of whether I like or dislike things.
right.
And if I select things, then they will push other things my way. But
Mm,
what they tend to push my way is things which will grab my attention, which, being the creatures that we are, will often consist of stuff that reinforces our prejudices or which confirms us in the view that people who take other views are really pretty despicable. And
right.
the trouble about this is that you've got something which then takes on almost the antithesis of the character of what Popper was urging on us if we are trying to discover the truth.
Mm,
Because
mhm.
if you just get stuff which reinforces your prejudices, if there were problems about your views, if you hadn't appreciated where other people are coming from, if all you get is stuff that confirms your caricatures them, you won't learn anything very much. But it's also the case that this, in a way, is spreading in a striking manner to other media as well. I mean, I was reading not long back, but I've had some experiences that have broadly confirmed this, that you've got now well, the thing that I was reading was a piece written by someone who had run the op-ed page in the New York Times for quite a while. And he said, look, we always had a policy of getting diverse viewpoints and perspectives. What
Mm,
he reported on was the way in which the news section of the New York Times had
right.
tended now to get more and more into a position where it was really taking up in the news reporting a single liberal perspective. Now, I'm
Right.
not saying in this that the liberal perspective may not be right, but the trouble is that if you get people who, I mean, there was an issue about the behavior of the Supreme Court, and the reporter essentially said, well, I went round and interviewed about this a number of distinguished uh, academic constitutional lawyers. And he says, in effect, well, all the leading ones were liberal, although I did interview one other chap who, while he's conservative, also agreed with me. And I thought, well, this isn't very helpful, because
Right.
there are not going to be many other places than something like the New York Times in which you can really get uh, in-depth reporting on important things in this sort of way. But
Mm-hmm.
if what you're getting is rather self-consciously selective in this manner, it's tricky. Now, you can obviously in the US, I mean, watch, if you can bear it, both Fox News and MSNBC. You can, if you take out subscriptions to journals and newspapers from different countries, you can, if you work at it, get different cuts on things. But how many people are actually going to do this? And so you've
Mm-hmm.
got at one level a kind of huge enabling of things. So that, I mean, standardly, I'm reading, I mean, it's only a limited list, the Times of London, New York Times, The Economist, The Guardian in London, which has
Like a leftist, not
US
leftist, but yeah, yeah.
perspective. And from this, one can sort of get a feel of, and then, but I mean, this costs a little bit, it takes a bit of time and so on. Whereas quite a lot of people depend for news on social media at the
Right.
moment.
Yeah.
And this then gets a little bit worrying. So I'd say on this score, it's not a kind of simple matter. It's difficult to know quite what one should do. And part of the problem is that we're basically making choices that we like, but that
Right.
the outcome may not be terribly good for us. I mean, it's a little bit like someone really liking very, very thick loaded pizza or something of this sort.
Right.
They may well like it, but it's not necessarily the outcome is going to be good for them. But what you do with that really can be pretty tricky. And what you do about it in a free and open society can be even trickier.
What, and then the problem there, and that I agree with you, that's a major problem. And a problem there is now you have politicians that are playing the same game, and in America in particular. I don't follow British politics that much, but where you have all they do is go out to make appearances in order to post them on Twitter, and
Yeah.
it plays to the same audience, and they're playing the same game. And again, as you say, people are accepting things, and Popper, to the detriment of what he was saying, people are accepting these things uncritically. So there's never
Yeah.
any critical rationalism going on. They're just embracing yet again another agreement.
Well, all I would say, but I hope this doesn't ruin the podcast, is that if you consider the case of a recently convicted felon in the
Mm.
United States who was in a reasonably prominent position, it was striking. It was
I'm
striking
no
that
fan, so you can say whatever.
some no, but I mean, the point I was going to make it about it was that
Right,
he is someone who specialized in a particular kind of theater, almost.
right.
I mean, it always seemed to me that it was no surprise that he should have, in earlier days, have been involved with the World Wrestling Federation.
Right. Right. He was actually at
He
one
was,
point.
yeah, this
Yeah.
is right. But the style is in many ways like the kind of storylines on those things. But
Right.
what is striking is that newspapers that didn't like him actually
Right.
produced long lists of things which he had claimed and which just weren't right. But
Exactly.
there is no mechanism through
Hmm.
which he's kind of sat down and actually asked, well, what do you say in response to this?
Hmm.
And a big danger here is that you get people who are, I mean, of which he is an exemplar, but with Boris Johnson in Britain seem to me to
Hmm.
be similar, who are interested really in playing to the gallery and not in issues about truth. I mean, it's a bit like with Trump. that
Mm.
he courted evangelical support when he basically said, "I've done nothing that ever needs forgiving."
Right.
And one thought, well, that there's a kind of, but the problem is that we've moved now to a system in which people just don't, in a certain sense, take seriously the issue of their own fallibility, and that it is a problem if they've said something that's false, and no one else much seems to care about this either. And
Mm.
to try, in a way, to restore within a free society institutions where we care about these things are tricky. And where, too, there's a further problem. I mean, if you take something like Chat GTP,
Mm.
really useful, and these things are getting extremely good. But as pieces which have reported recently on um, Google's attempts to get into this and some of the difficulties that they have encountered have reported. The
Mm.
trouble is that if they're just going through material they find on the internet, they may pick up all kinds of stuff, which, I mean, Google hit the problem that they were picking up and reporting in their little kind of almost Wikipedia style pieces that they produce, stuff that had actually been based on satirical articles
Mm.
where they
Hmm.
no and you get a whole lot of other stuff which is out there. I mean, like on vaccine things and so on, where either people are nuts, or they're just preoccupied with a particular perspective and won't take criticism seriously, or they're trying to make money out of it. But where all this gets put into the mix, and trying to unsort it then becomes a rather difficult matter. And I mean, I've got ideas as to how one might tackle this, but that's really a big problem in its own right. And there's the question as to how things would be possible, whether people would pay for them, and so on and so on. But my worries in this area are that there's been evolution and development in terms of the way in which media constitute a public sphere, which may take us a long way away from the kind of exchanges of views which John Stuart Mill in On Liberty and Popper in his work were kind of expecting would be taken for granted,
Hmm.
and where I think it then becomes an interesting problem of piecemeal social engineering. Is
Mm.
there any way out of this? But
Man.
I won't say any more about this now because we've already taken up another huge hunk of time.
Oh, well, that's great. Man, Jeremy, this has been nothing but a pleasure. And let's do this again. We can continue basically. I feel like we've built a good foundation here, and we can get into more of the meat of things and also
Yes, of course.
your criticisms of Popper in a later date.
Yeah,
But
yeah. No, that'll be good.
yeah, okay. Well, cool. It was very good to meet you, Jeremy, and I
And
will talk to you later.